All right. Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another Learning Talks, where we are continuing to explore the landscape of, I'm just going to say, all things workplace technology. We are going, if the backstage conversation that actually led right up to me hitting the countdown is any indication of the kind of conversation that Mike and I are going to have today, you're going to want to stay tuned into this one because it's going to be a fun one. So I'm joined by Mike Parks. He's the CEO of Inkling, and I'm going to let him describe what it's all about, but we're going to be talking about, I don't know even the best way to describe what we're going to be getting into, but really connecting the dots between performance and learning and what I would say operational workflows and how we can tell that value story. So I'll see if you have a better way of describing it. But Mike, thanks so much for joining me.
Chris, thank you so much. I'm really excited to be on the podcast and looking forward to the conversation.
Hey, this is going to be fun. And it's very rare that I get someone who is in the same region of the US with me. So you're just like a stone's throw down the road for me.
I could be at your house in 2 hours. And yeah,
I love you know what? There you go. Well, maybe next time we'll do a follow-up and we'll have a beer on the patio or something like that. And we'll shoot this live since it's a nice time of year. But anyway, so let's jump into this with you. So you're the CEO of Inkling. I am really curious. Let's actually start with, when people say, what is Inkling, which if you've been in the L&D space, you may or may not have heard of it. Because again, the category they play in is a little bit different. So I'd love to hear how you describe when you tell people you're the CEO of Inkling. Like, what do you describe Inkling as?
Yeah, that's a great question. And maybe I'll back it up for just a minute and talk about the state of the business when I got here and where Inkling started. So Inkling was founded in 2009 by a group of engineers and product folk that came out of Apple. Right at the time when the original iPad was developed. And they wanted to build, back, I think, before it was even a thing, a no-code, low-code authoring tool to enable them to create EPUBs that would have rich, dynamic, engaging content on a medium like the iPad. And they saw tremendous success early on with customers like McGraw-Hill and Elsevier, amazing publishing companies using that platform. They made a strategic shift in, let's call it 2013, 2014, to focus on enterprise customers with a similar.
Because there was a lot, if I remember back the early days, it was very much, I mean, when I think Inkling originally, it was like digital ink. That was a big kind of the way people thought about it. It was a way to digitize what most people would consider ink.
Yeah, 100%. And going back and looking at some of the initial business cases for some of our first enterprise customers, like McDonald's is a fantastic customer. And they rolled out Inkling to displace Fred, which is their operational manual that they would print and bind and send it to every franchise in their language across the globe 4 times a year. And the challenges were the cost of the printing and the binding and the sending out. And then the day we send it, it's out of date.
It's already out of date. Right. Yeah. Anybody in the learning industry is familiar with the days of binders where that was the bane of our exit. You take the time to do all this. You literally got it and then sent it out, and the cost was exorbitant.
Yeah. So the initial use case for McDonald's was to digitize Fred, right? To create this massive standard operating procedure guidebook for a franchise manager and their staff that was a living, breathing, always up-to-date reference library. And over time, McDonald's has sort of tried to force that ebook into a training tool. And it's in and of itself, right? Habitat plus knowledge, which is our authoring tool plus distribution mechanism. It's a great way to disseminate content and measure engagement. It does not measure like learning efficacy. And so that's a gap for us. And then we added we call it learning pathways. So a structured pathway guide, step-by-step learning that can happen in 30 minutes to an hour, 2 to 5 minute chunks, even 30-second, like quick reference guide videos that can be pushed down or it can be searched. And so when I look at us today, I certainly think that a market is forming to serve what I would call the distributed enterprise worker. And when I think about that distributed learner at Inkling, that distributed learner could be a 3rd grader in an elementary school, someone in a college course. It could be a frontline worker in retail or restaurant or hospitality. And it certainly could be used for like sales enablement organizations. And we serve all of those today. But when I got here, Inkling positioned themselves as sort of a unicorn in the HR tech landscape. And it was
And I want to talk about your journey in, but one of the things that because I was familiar with it even in its early days when it was first getting its legs. And I think one of the things that I noticed as a distinguishing factor different from other tech in this marketplace was Inkling was approaching more they were doing the workflow learning or performance support before it was cool. Like before the industry was like, hey, this is like a cool thing. We need to do learning in the flow of work and we need to do performance support. Inkling was already, that was where you started. It was like, well, that's duh. That's what we do. And to your point, it was the other companies I think have tried to go, well, we were trying to think of learning as kind of this separate thing that happens. And then now the push has been, well, now how do we make this happen in the workflow? And that's wrought with challenges as we're going to get into when we actually think about some of these more difficult use cases. Like a lot of these workers we're talking about, they're not sitting behind a computer conveniently able to pull up some of this stuff and go, oh, let me go through this content right now while I'm at my desk, because there's no desk.
100%. And I wish I could take credit for it, but I'm not, at this point in my career, I'm not sure I've ever had an original thought. But there were some brilliant people at Inkling. It's sadly true. There were some brilliant people at Inkling that came up with the idea of, teach test should be flipped on its head, and we should do, find, learn, and do. And that's where that like learning in the flow of work comes from. Do not take the learner to training. Bring training to the learner, specifically if it's from.
Yeah. Well, and we've got some OGs who are following along, because that was kind of back in the day, that really what it was. It was that e-reading platform. So before we get into digging into some of this stuff, when did you then join the organization, and what actually ended up, is your background in this space? I mean, how did you end up at Inkling?
Yeah, I'll be happy to kind of walk through what that timeline looks like. I've taken a very interesting path to the position I have today. So I went to school and studied English composition and broadcast journalism. I was convinced that I was going to be a sports reporter. As I was going to school, I was working for, at the time, what was, I think, Alpha Beta, then Food for Less, then Ralph's. Then we got bought by Fred Meyer and eventually Kroger. And I was a director my senior year in college. And when I went out and started applying for jobs, quickly learned that I was making significantly more as a store director than I would make as a starting salary in the newspaper. So you had the job to support what you thought you were going to do, and then learned, hey, wait a minute, I think I may have this backwards. Yeah, I mean, certainly at 22 in like the early 90s in Southern California, I was like, wait, why would I make 40% of what I'm making today? And so I stayed in operations, decided I was going to give grocery a go, and at that time hadn't embraced it. And as soon as I did, I sort of fell in love with that business. I got offered an opportunity to go into the corporate office in like management development and technical training right at the time that Kroger purchased Fred Meyer, which was amazing for me. So we got to develop all of the training materials, all of the guides, do the in-person and on-site training on every Kroger operating system across 430 stores and 30,000 employees, which would be a cool learning experience. Then I took the Food for Less banner from Southern California to Chicago with a group of like 15 transplants, and we did site selection, ground ups, construction, staffing of the first 21 stores here, which was cool. I left.
You were really in the ops. I mean, you were really in the operations of that space.
100%. Then I left the Kroger company and I went to work for an independent here in the Midwest called Strachan Van Til, where I did maintenance, energy, and worked on construction projects with a gentleman named John Ritchie for a while. Loved that job. But when I went to go from, the efficacy that is Kroger to a smaller Midwest grocery chain, quickly learned that we didn't have systems. So I went to market for some enterprise SaaS solutions. And I bought an enterprise refrigerant management solution and a computerized maintenance management solution from a company called Verisay. Now,
did you always have the technical acumen? Like, was that, because I'm thinking broadcast journalism, then you get into grocery, like where'd the tech piece, because even some of the things you're describing, there's a bit of a technical acumen that comes with kind of seeing the possibilities of what this tech stuff could do to help some of that. Was that a natural thing, or did you just kind of discover that along the way?
Well, I think people have skill sets and abilities, but like most people that really lean into work, you find mentors in organizations that are personally vested in your success. So I can look back and name like Wayne Buck or Jay Cummins or Chris Bauer, throughout my career that leaned in and helped me develop a skill set that I didn't have in myself by kind of challenging me and allowing me to fail fast, if that makes sense.
It's the best way to learn, quite frankly.
Yeah, it is, right? To empower you to make decisions and make mistakes. And when you make a mistake, hey, let's talk about it, as opposed to
and be really good at putting you in those environments where you can do that and you're not just causing total chaos. And it's like, hey, we're going to let you do that. Then we're going to talk about it. We're going to grow you and then just continue to expand that out. Okay. That's awesome.
Yeah. So funny story. So when we opened the Food for Less division in the Midwest, I had written a manual on the Kroger accounting system when we deployed Kroger systems back in Southern California.
Your background in communications played out there for you.
It did. Like 9 months later, we get people from Kroger corporate that are going to come down and teach us about Kroger financials and the store operating system as we're opening our first store. And they come out and they put this manual on my desk and they go, so we want you to go home and read this. This is going to be the basis of our training on Monday. I'm like, oh, I wrote that. I'm like, no, you didn't. I go, yeah, I did. I don't think I have to read it. I'm good. But yeah, so long story short, I spent some time in construction, energy, bought tools from a company called Verisay. I didn't know at the time that was a private equity-backed business owned by a company called Marlin. And we deployed the solution. I presented at their user conference. We drove, through diligence of the team and utilization of the tool, fantastic operational savings on that platform. I presented at their user conference, and the CEO of the company reached out to me and said he could use someone like me to teach other customers how to use their software. So it took him about 17 months, but he convinced me to leave operations at 40. So this is, let's call it 10 and a half years ago, and join a software company. And I went to work for Verisay in Minneapolis in, I think, May of 2012, as I think my first title was Director of Customer Success. And I did not know a lot about what that was when I joined the org, but quickly found that I was being tasked with, for lack of a better term, being a strategic consultant for lots of people that had jobs like mine, to help them drive costs out of refrigerant management, energy management, computerized maintenance management. And eventually we built an IoT tool, like a machine-to-machine monitoring tool, to improve the efficacy of those locations.
Okay. And so then how did Inkling come into the mix? Was that a tool you used at an organization and then they were like, hey, do you want to come run this? Or like, how did that play out?
No, so super interesting. So we built that business, Verisay, from 2012 to 2016. We sold it to Accruent in 2016. And then we sold Accruent to Fortive in 2018. And I served as the Senior Vice President of IoT Strategy, so Internet of Things strategy, at Fortive, which is a publicly traded, I think $7 or $8 billion company, before coming here. And I had been reached out to by someone in my network about a presidency of a smaller IoT company that I've always wanted to. I've spent a lot of time in my life executing other people's strategies and doing it well, because I'm an operator. And I've always wondered, could I develop and execute my own with the team? So this role was sort of somewhat appealing, although the business had some warts, as all businesses do. And I reached out to someone in my network, Jerry Dolinsky. He had been my CEO at Verisay, and he was with Marlin now. And he was connected to the CEO of this business. And so I just reached out and said, hey, what do you know about them? What do you know about the company and the opportunity? And he said, if I had known that you were interested in leaving Fortive, I would have offered you a job before. I've got a great company that I think you would be perfect for. And that's how the conversation started. I had an opportunity to talk to Jeff Carr, the previous CEO, talk to a few people in the business before I joined. And, there's no perfect business, but the caliber of people within Inkling and the investment they made in the product, we've got a really...
Well, and honestly, the opportunity, quite frankly, I've been familiar with Inkling since its very early days, and where they were going and what they were looking to solve for. It was a significant, continues to be a significant gap in what I would consider the workplace tech stack that a lot of organizations, especially, so let's talk about this, because in terms of target market, or where you talk a lot about frontline, and Inkling does really, I think, hit on a lot of what happens on the front lines. Would you say that's your sweet spot in terms of that frontline enablement? I mean, where do you tend to play?
Yeah. So I mean, we're not a massive organization. My sales team and my reach is somewhat limited. I think we have pretty broad tentacles, not to play off the Inkling theme too much there, that we could reach out to. But today we have tier 1 and tier 2 industries. So I would argue that
Okay.
like retail, restaurant, hospitality,
Okay.
and then healthcare and life sciences. That's where we build strategic go-to-market plans. There's adjacent markets like media and education, manufacturing that are certainly interesting to us, and we take inbounds for them. But in terms of our outbound go-to-market approach, it's those 5 industries.
Okay. That makes sense, because I know I've been in the life sciences space a good chunk of my career, and that may be why I'm more familiar with Inkling than maybe some of the folks who may be listening or doing that. But I do know, based on the product, that frontline experience is really, or again, I can see where manufacturing would have some really key opportunities. So let's talk a little bit about, because some people may be hearing this going like, okay, I kind of get it, but let's talk about what we're actually talking about when we talk about the tech. Because if people haven't experienced what Inkling's doing, we've talked about digital ink and how that plays, and hopefully everybody listening can start to put the pieces together on how that may work. But let's walk through a use case of like, where would somebody be struggling with this that you would go, this is a prime use case for where you would want to apply Inkling, and these are the kind of problems it's designed to solve for.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't have a lot of skills, but one of them might be storyteller. So I'll try to give a real world example. So we have a no code, low code authoring tool that's called Habitat, and it is a differentiator for Inkling. The ability for non-technical subject matter experts to create rich, dynamic content that is consistent with the company's brand, and more than that, like I tell this analogy all the time that. Documentation, training, information, it typically comes from the top down. But the subject matter experts, the people that really know how to do the work,
people that actually know the information and know how it actually works, they're not sitting in a conference room.
Yeah, they're out in the field. I call them Liam Neeson, people with a particular set of skills, right? And so how do we create a tool that
you should have said it with the accent, but
all right, I can't do it. But how do we enable these people to be collaborators in our process, right? To give feedback before we publish something, and maybe even after we publish something, so that living, breathing ebook or training plan has the most up-to-date information. And Inkling enables organizations to do that. So, imagine a world where I'm a quick serve restaurant chain, and I do something like limited time offerings, and I do those limited time offerings maybe once a month, or I have to react to what competition does, and so I might have to do them more frequently than that. And so, how do I quickly create a training plan that includes, a recipe guide, a quick reference guide, some video training, because people don't learn the same. Like, I'm an informational learner. So if I buy something new, I immediately pull the manual out and read it cover to cover before I do anything else, where most people are action learners, right?
I'll just go do it. Yeah, I'll just start doing it
and figure it out. Sure. And so when you think about that training content, it has to be sort of a choose your own adventure. The learner has to say, what do I want to do? Do I want to read a book? Do I want to walk through step by step on a card with some flip overs and some questions? Or do I want to watch a video of someone explaining how to do it and showing? But none of those things, like traditional learning management systems, they have gating, and gating doesn't equal learning. Like, the time spent in a video doesn't mean I understand the salient concepts. And so
that's much more of a compliance mindset to, we have to get everybody through the exact same experience. And it doesn't account for the dynamic nature of, first of all, people's preferences, but also the way work happens. I mean, work isn't nice and gated often.
Yeah. And I mean, if I'm in an environment like that, so let's pretend that I'm the restaurant manager at franchise 123. I don't have 45 minutes to sit down and dedicate away from my guests and away from my employees to learn how to do this thing. I have to be able to do it in the flow of work in bite-sized chunks, right? And Inkling can enable that. So in this world, I create this training curriculum, and it includes assessments, and maybe it includes some coaching and feedback. So at the conclusion of my training, I'm actually going to make let's pretend it's a pork and potato burrito, because those are delicious. So I'm going to make this pork, potato, and cheese burrito. And then I'm going to go take it to my manager. I'm going to get feedback that A, it looks equal to or greater than brand standards, and B, it tastes delicious. I would want to buy that, right? And so you create this training plan, you push it down across your organization, 1,000+ locations on a Wednesday, and the menu items drop the following Monday. And so you need to have these leading indicators that are, what is the engagement by region, by district, by restaurant of people going through the training materials? What percentage is complete as we go towards launch? What percentage of them have passed the assessment at 80%, 90%, 100%? What coaching and feedback has been done? And then the beauty would be to correlate that data with operational performance data. So when the menu item
is that new product moving, things like that.
Sure. And so when you think about like solving that problem for the customer, we can provide some of those data ingredients. We can provide the engagement scores, the assessment scores, the coaching and feedback mechanism, but the operational performance data. So in theory, I'm launching this new menu item because I want to sell it. So how many do I sell per restaurant? And then what is the customer satisfaction score when people buy that menu item? And do they come back and buy another one and another one? And so if you could, as a learning and development team, if you could show these leading indicators of, hey, restaurants that have engagement scores over 90% and assessment scores that average 85% or higher across all employees, their sales revenue is 125% better than restaurants that don't. And that's nirvana for an L&D team to be able to.
Well, which goes back to some of the challenges I think that sometimes come up where it's like, oh, learning is a difficult thing to measure impact, but it's not if you're doing it as we're describing right here. You're actually tying it to the work and actually embedding it in, which is where I think the embedding of learning or performance enablement I honestly think of the word learning. I sometimes have a hard time using when I think of what Inkling does, more so because I really see it as a performance enabler. And is learning happening along the way? Yes. But I think sometimes when I think of learning, I think of this abstract secondary, we pull you out and you go do a thing, versus really where you're focused. And even just what you described in that use case is it's learning while doing. Learning is working and working is learning. You're just kind of taking this forward and then seeing how it happens.
Yeah, I think that's super fair. And you mentioned something that's really important, like starting with the measurement. I think it's so critical that organizations begin with the end in mind, and that is also not a new or novel concept. I think Galileo is credited with saying, like, measure what is measurable and make measurable what is not. So if you have an initiative that includes 0 metrics, it's going to fail. It's doomed for failure. And then if you wait until 2 or 3 years later and say, I want to pull data in and evaluate if it's working or not. I think it's Ronald Coase who said, if you torture the data long enough, it will confess to anything. Right. So if I don't set out.
Well, and I think that's one of the problems that we can talk about from the measurement side, that a lot of times this stuff happens. And to your point, we don't define what are we trying to accomplish on the front end. And if you do that, going back to it, where you end up is the thing happened, and now you're looking at this data and trying to backtrack into, well, what do we think that tells us? And just by default, I mean, the quote you used is perfect for it, because that's a lot of times what happens. Well, how do we manipulate this, and what kind of conclusions can we draw that validate what we were hoping? Maybe we can go back and what kind of good story can we tell based on it, versus saying, we said we were going to try and do this. Did that happen? It did or it didn't, and then what do we do about it?
Yeah, and oftentimes with this top-down approach, we live in this bubble of, well, if we do it this way, this is how the restaurant or the store or the sales team, this is how they're going to engage with our content. At Fortive, I had the opportunity to work with a woman named Kirsten Paust, who leads the Fortive Business Systems office, and she used to talk all the time about the importance of voice of the customer and going to Gemba where the work gets done. And so it doesn't mean like doing a 15 or 30-minute conversation with a customer and asking questions. It means, hey, coming up with a hypothesis and asking the customer, can I go on site with the people that I think I'm going to impact? And so can I test this in the wild, right? And so when I develop this training plan, if I think that I'm going to get 30 minutes of Jimmy the Fry Guy's time to sit and go through a module, I need to go to the restaurant and watch what they're up against. Because with turnover over 100% and busy customers, it's not feasible.
No, and I think that's where I have had a number of guests on the show who really I feel like the frontline worker is one of the most underserved, which is unfortunate because they also happen to be the largest percentage of the population in most organizations. And that conversation you just had right there about the importance of recognizing the experience that they're in, a lot of times that's not truly taken into consideration. It's, well, this is how it should happen. And it's like, but that's just not reality. I mean, maybe even in our idealistic state, that's how we'd like it to be. But the demands of what's expected of you on a day-to-day basis, the flow of work, the flow of customers, things like that, you just can't set that aside and go, I just need to put this on pause so I can go do this other thing. It's just not a reality.
Yeah, I think you're spot on in the fact that they're underserved, but I also think that they're misunderstood. Like if you think about
Yes.
people like ourselves, like white collar workers, anyone who tells you that the lines between working time and non-working time and the ability to have some flex in work-life balance post-COVID is not wildly disparate from it was pre-COVID, I would argue they're lying. Like those lines are as blurry as they've ever been. And
Yes.
across my employee base, it's get your work done. To be honest, except for critical meetings, I don't care when you get it done. The white collar worker does not have that same level of freedom because they're expected to produce for a specific period of time, scheduled probably through some.
The frontline worker, just to clarify, the frontline worker is the one who does not have that luxury.
No, some digital transformation automatic scheduling system has said from 8 to 4:30, you're working in this station. And then we put all these other guardrails around them. Like we don't embrace bring your own device. We don't allow them to blur the lines between their social life, maybe their social media profile and their work life, which is what they want. They want to feel like they're part of something. And I think that if we embrace that more, you could create brand advocates for your organization, right? That were
So what I was going to say on this one that I think is, I love where you're going on this, because the misunderstanding piece is a really important one. And one of the ways that I've talked about this a lot recently is I hear this when I talk to frontline workers, or I'll talk to senior leaders who say, well, we just can't offer flexibility to frontline workers. And my pushback to that is, have you asked them what that means? Because I think in your head, you have this assumption of what they're asking. And oftentimes it's not actually what you're thinking as a white collar worker, where you're like, well, I want to work remotely 100%. Half the time, that's not actually what they're talking about. And some of the things you hit on of, well, I want the ability to flex my schedule as needed, or I want the ability to integrate, or, I want the ability to have things on my phone so I don't have to always, some of these things that we don't even take the time to have the conversation and understand, what does that actually mean to you? What would actually change and improve your quality of work? We just draw these lines and go, well, this is what I think you mean, and therefore we can't accommodate that. And I've seen organizations transform things incredibly for their frontline forces when they take the time to, what you just said, understand where they are and what they're actually talking about.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. I mean, we live in a world where it's rightfully so, but wage inflation post-COVID for that frontline worker has become a thing. Like I remember, I was 16 when I started at Skaggs Alpha Beta back in 1988 in Southern California. And it was the job that you wanted to have because it paid 50 cents an hour more than minimum wage. It was a union job. And so you immediately started to earn some sort of benefit. Today, I'm going to make $15 to $18 an hour anywhere that I work. And I don't mean to be disparaging, but like shagging carts on January 5th when it's -8 degrees in Chicago is significantly harder work than working at the movie theater and saying, do you want Coke or Sprite? And they pay the same. And so if I don't create a differentiated employee onboarding experience and an ability for employees to grow and have some freedom and flexibility, they're going to vote with their feet. I'm going to lose them.
Yeah. No, and you see, to your point, the data shows it. And this is one of the things where you see organizations going, well, why can't we retain people in these roles? And you go, it's a terrible working experience. I mean, the working experience sucks. And there are, and sometimes you'll see people relent and go, well, but there's nothing we can do about it. And it's, no, actually there are. To your point, there are absolutely things you can do to differentiate, because money isn't the only differentiating factor.
Oh, 100%. And we see it across our customer base. Whole Foods is a fantastic example of an organization that's doing things outside of Inkling to enable their employees to have an experience that is differentiated from the traditional retailer with frontline workers. So, allowing associates to, trade shifts and have the empowerment to do that without any type of manager approval, creating these occupational learning paths so that once I learn how to do a job and I'm proficient in that job, I get these branches of what else I can do, what other skills I can develop, which enables me to be scheduled more, earn more per hour, create this sense of gig economy and this sense of belonging and self. Doug Eichhorn, Courtney Cordova, the team there, they're just doing an amazing job. And I think there are models for other organizations to look at. And so if you're in a situation today where your turnover is over 100% for your frontline worker, you have to start measuring, what are we doing to change that? If you're not doing exit interviews with those folk to understand why they're leaving you, because nobody takes a job at an organization and says, I don't want to do a good job and I don't want to be here. We have a customer who shall remain nameless, who told us that 1 out of 10 employees doesn't make it to day 2. Like, there's a critical failure happening somewhere there.
That is a massive fail. Yeah. Well, and to your point, I think this is, again, going back to even some of the assumptions, and I battle back with this a lot, is, being willing to have those conversations and actually listen to what it is. What is it that's actually going on with this, and recognizing, what, there are things we can do about it because this is a negative experience and we can change that. And then taking the time to be able to prioritize, where can we make a dramatic impact? And one of the things you hit on that I'm going to transition to with this, that as you were talking about how Inkling is used in the workflow with this does tie to the skilling conversation, because I think that career mobility and where people can go and what they can do with their career is very much tied to the skills. And I think one of the advantages that we have in the frontline space is I won't say it's easier, but there are ways that we can do a better job of seeing where skills are and where they're happening. And even just what you described, the ability to see, hey, who are the people who actually are capable of doing all these things? These people are eligible and capable of moving on to do different things. And they have a lot more latitude to be able to control that than they would in an environment where they don't have access to those things.
Yeah, I think that's perfectly true. I mean, everyone, hopefully, in their life has had the experience of working for someone that was personally invested in their success and wanted to put them in a position where they could achieve more. And so organizations should embrace technology that enables them to push that from the top down. If you're not giving your employees opportunities to grow, their skill set to grow, their ability to earn, it's not a question of when they will leave you. It's a question of, if they will leave you. It's a question of when. Right?
It's when.
They will find a path somewhere else. And so progressive organizations are putting those employees in a position where they have clearly defined career paths. And when they meet a gating criteria, doors open to what the next gating criteria potentially can be. And training is often done to prepare folk to do something new or different, but it should also be done to repair. Like if we're marrying performance data to training data, if I start to slip, if I'm exhibiting a skill set that is degrading over time, I should get some helpful hints and tips from my training tool that are push notifications to me that allow me to do better because I want to perform, right? And those tips and tricks, maybe they're not coming from top down. Maybe they're coming from the top performers in the organization, right? Here are some things that I'm doing to deliver results that are equal to or greater than company standard.
So let me ask you this, because I think this ties to the skill piece. And I think in many organizations, this is an area that some are further along than others, but I can see how Inkling can play a role in this. Is how work got done in many cases historically there's been a lot of tribal knowledge. It's been in some regards a black hole, which I think has a lot of organizations in serious risk who aren't addressing this, because as we come into the gray tsunami, as the workforce just continues to transition, you run the risk of a lot of your intellectual capital walking out the door. Like, this is not just we'll figure it out. I mean, this is a true threat. If you're a CEO, this is concerning of how you're going to handle that. How do organizations, or do you see organizations kind of getting started on that? Because I do see, and I think it's great that where you're going with this is it is enabling those folks, which by the way, I've seen as a great way to differentiate in terms of like, well, okay, being a subject matter expert actually is career mobility. Once you've demonstrated you have this, there's actual promotability things you can do with this. But how do you see organizations making this transition? Because the buzzword in the L&D industry is like user generated content, which can mean a span of things, can mean somebody, making a Facebook reel video to actually like, no, they're actually working with some of this stuff. But that's not always an easy thing to govern or kickstart. So where do organizations typically get started with this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I wish it was a one size fits all. I mean, you mentioned everybody's in a different place on that journey, and that's okay.
Very
like
much so.
you have to start with where you are, and you have to start with what am I trying to accomplish next. But we don't offer them. They're certainly available in the marketplace. Collaboration tools that allow frontline employees to engage with one another, I think, is a great place to start, to allow that mind share and maybe not corporate governance around what is and what is not shared or permissible. Allowing collaboration on initial creation of content, I think, is also incredibly important. But we've got a couple customers, Ecolab and G6 are good examples of this, where brand consistency and investment in the employee onboarding process, all the, from the first day an employee joins an organization until the last day the employee decides, maybe I don't want to work here anymore. The level of diligence that is put into ensuring that the employee has the tools necessary to be successful and the support of the organization at times of duress, I think that of our customer base, I would put those two, at the top. Chris Eliot's and the team at Ecolab, they bring every new account rep into their facility and do live training, instructor-led training on site. They also have virtual classes. So there's like a hybrid model that they deploy over a series of weeks. I think they do 2 or 3 weeks on site through this training program. And then they provide them with an ongoing reference library that includes like push notifications of where you might need help.
Well, and what you just articulated there, I think it's important for people to consider this, because sometimes I see what I would consider false dichotomy often rage in the industry of, well, do we do away with one and move to this? And there was a push, I think for good reason, in the industry. For a while, learning was kind of this hookah lounge, beanbag chair thing. You went and did it, and it was this nice getaway. And then there was this push to move more towards a performance enablement mindset, which I think was much needed. But I don't think it's a either or type of situation. And even just what you described with some of your highlighted customers, it's like they're kind of doing the best of both worlds, where they're saying, yes, we still have this high touch, laying the foundation of, hey, here's what you need to know. We want to create an extraordinary employee experience. And then as we send you out to actually get into the work, you are fully supported using the tools that actually drive enablement in real time type of a thing. So it's not dump one and move to the other. It's, well, no, how do you marry those two together well?
Yeah, I think that's fair. And my operations and finance background is probably going to bear its ugly head here, and I might get a little bit too aggressive. If you play in the HR L&D space today, and you, like most organizations, have a swath of technologies that they leverage. They typically don't just have one tool. So let's pretend you have 1 or 2 authoring tools. You have an LMS, you have an LCMS, you have an LXP, an HRIS system. If you cannot describe the quantifiable value of each of those solutions to the organization, you're at risk of a consolidation coming from the CFO or procurement, people coming in and saying, I want to evaluate the technologies that we use. And potentially, if we can't articulate the differentiated value of each of those things, I might wind up with tools that are just good enough. And the person that pays for that debt is the learner, right? And so
they're the one that suffer when we don't do a good job on this.
Yeah, and so I mean, think about it like your own personal investment strategy, right? If you invest money into 15 different things and 6 of them you don't understand the return and you can't see it, you're going to stop telling your money to go there.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. So I'm trying to think. There was a second avenue so let's talk operation. Oh yeah, this is what I was going to ask about, because you talked about some of the consistency that organizations are using with this. Because I think what I do see, and I would love where we go with this, because I think this will tie in the BYOD conversation as well, is there is this line of like hyper governance, and then there's this free for all, just kind of let people do their thing. And we'll start with kind of the Inkling side of it, but I think this will even tie to like BYOD type policy stuff. Is so when you look at the way organizations are managing some of these resources and the collateral that they're creating in here, where do you find that sweet spot where you say, yes, there is some corporate command and control where, going back to, we want it to be brand consistent. You know, I'm familiar with the McDonald's crew. Rob Lauber and I know each other well. You know, and I know that there are some of these things where it's like, if you're at McDonald's and you run a McDonald's location, there are some things that this is just how it's done.
Yep.
Again, for brand experience, we don't want people coming to your restaurant and going, you know, chili cheese dogs. Like, what is this? I've never had a McDonald's type of thing. But then there's also knowing like where that line is to go. Yes, you have to have some flexibility to go, well, you know, your market, you know, what's going on here. As you think about the authoring of some of these, where are organizations finding that sweet line? Because sometimes I see organizations freak out about that co-authored collaborative content design, because they're like, well, boy, if we don't govern it. And I know a lot of L&D leaders sometimes lean into this where they're like, oh gosh, if we let people do this, they're just going to go off the rails.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a double-edged sword. I mean, I mentioned a little bit the collaborator capabilities that a lot of authoring tools have, right? So if I go out to the field to subject matter experts, to people that are top performers, maybe that I know and trust, and I ask for feedback, there should be a feedback loop that comes back to the author or owner of that document that says, yes, I agree, or yes, I should make that change, or yes, I should add that detail. If you continue to go, no, that doesn't align with brand standards, and you never incorporate any of the feedback from your Liam Neesons out in the field, they're just going to stop giving you feedback, right? Because these people are doing it because...
And they quit using the stuff too. They're like, well, forget this. This isn't even how we do it.
Right. They want to be advocates of change. They see that you are not willing to change. And so they go from being, you know, an advocate to potentially even an adversary, where it's like, well, don't read that manual. It's not going to teach you what you need to know. Instead, you need to do it this way.
Okay. Yeah, so in that process, and again, I'm just thinking from a learning operations, are most organizations, because this is the other thing that I've seen not work, or present its own challenges. And I know I've got a lot of learning leaders on here, is I see this where sometimes organizations will lean on the subject matter expert and say, now you do it, which a lot of times, going back to the example of the frontline worker, it's almost just piling a burden on them, going, you seriously want me to create all of this stuff on top of my day-to-day? Where do you find that right balance, or where do you see people having success with that balance of they're contributing to the authorship, but there's still some central ownership of, hey, we'll make sure we take care of that and manage that relationship well, so what you're sharing is getting integrated into it?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, ultimately, I've got, you know, an instructional designer, an author that's working on content. They should always start with a jumping off point before I go to subject matter experts and say, hey, here's my hypothesis on what I think I will work well. And you touched on an important point too. Like, there are some things that, again, going back to the operator in me, people just need to get in line and march. Like, there are governmental and statutory regulations that I can't get around. Like, you need to clean the restroom once an hour. You need to sweep the floor every 2 hours from a risk compliance standpoint. The regulations on food safety standards, I can't change those. So this product needs to be held below 40 degrees. No one's going to alter that and go, it's okay at 44. So you have to have that level of compliance in check. But, you know, the most efficient way to make menu item A, or potentially even altering of the recipe to get better CSAT scores, that should be open to people to collaborate to.
Okay.
I mean, ultimately, you're trying to empower people to have a direct impact on the performance and bottom line of the organization, right? And so if I'm, you know, the chef at a restaurant, or if I'm the general manager at a hotel, and you don't put me in a position where I can create a differentiated experience for my guest, or a differentiated experience for my diner that makes them want to come back, because I have to follow a policy that puts me on such governed guide rails that I don't have any leniency to do so. Yeah, I mean, and that's, you know, one of the other ways where I think Inkling is different. A lot of organizations, they focus on personas like the director of L&D or that instructional designer, and we We don't. We have two primary personas. The first is that distributed frontline learner. We are relentless in our pursuit of allowing organizations to create engagement with those folk so they can build lasting relationships and hopefully increase tenure over time. But our secondary persona is our customer's customer, right? How do we make sure that the guest experience at McDonald's or Taco Bell or Whole Foods is equal to or greater than expectations? We want our frontline employees to be able to delight their guests.
And so this actually leads me, and again, just but then also just being in a company that's trying to walk this line. I mean, right now, what's been interesting is watching over the past few years how organizations are going through some serious transformation and feeling some real pressure around this, because this command and control versus autonomy and going, you know what, let's control what we can control. But then we need to kind of let go and trust that people actually know what they're doing and are actually going to deliver a great product. And that really is going back to your very earlier comment. Nobody signs up for a job and goes, you know what I want to do? Come up and be a terrible employee. I just want to do a crap job and all this. People genuinely want to do this. So as you see organizations going through this, how are you seeing organizations influence this to move into a positive direction? Because I think getting that line right almost determines how effective some of this stuff will be out of the gate. If you're an organization that has a very draconian mindset that everything has to be run from here, we can't trust anything to the people on the ground, in many regards, you can be creating more problems than you're solving.
Oh, 100%. So if I think about the predominant two generations that make up that frontline distributed learner today, it is the millennials and the Gen Zs. And so to me, everything starts with what you mentioned a little bit earlier, which is meeting them on the device that they use most, that they've had in their hand since they were 3, right? Which is empowering them to have the training, the information, the ability to collaborate on their personal device. And I know there are concerns about security and compensatory time. I'm a firm believer that all of those can be managed really easily. I mean, so think about again, I mentioned Whole Foods before. They're a great customer. They've made an investment in hardware. So they have a significant number of devices available for employees to use while they're in the store. And they're not just leveraged for Inkling. There's a variety of applications that are used at the location. But the challenge with that is that it's a significant capital outlay. Those devices will need to be refreshed, let's pretend, every 3.5 or 4 years. Every statistic tells me that 99.7% of those two generations have a smart device today, and that they will refresh their device 2 years earlier than the company can afford to refresh that. So I'm solving a problem that has already been solved by my employee base, and I don't want to make
because they're carrying the thing around already.
So, the questions happen in the flow of work on the sales floor, right? And so if I'm walking down aisle 7 and a customer says, "Hey, can you help me with XYZ?" We live in a world where people aren't offended anymore if you go, "Yeah, let me look that up for you." They're not if you pull out your device. But if you have to say, "Oh, just a minute, let me go to the back room," or "Let me go up front to the binder," you're running the risk of that customer's experience being less than you would expect it to be because the time takes too long. And then there's no guarantee that that employee isn't going to have one or multiple more interruptions as they go get the answer to bring it back to the
right. Because I mean, I'm just even thinking myself, if I go to Home Depot or whatever, right, and pick something up at the store and I ask somebody for something, inevitably, if they have to go somewhere, somebody else grabs them and goes, "Can you help me with this?" Somebody else goes, "Hey, I need your quick." And sometimes it can lead to a terrible customer experience where you go, "You know what, forget this." And you just leave.
Yeah. And not just a terrible customer experience, a frustrating experience for the employee. So think about everything else in their life, right? I mean, we live in a world where all of the information and disinformation, it's available
at our fingertips.
I can get it anytime I want. I mean, there's, I love Amazon, but any purchase, no matter how trivial and small, at my door in an hour, right? Like the level of expectation we have, we can't allow that to exist in people's personal lives. And then when they come to work, let them down by giving them, a less engaging sense of now experience, right? I mean, you can't debate, like I love sports. I can't debate sports with friends or my boys anymore because, oh, let me Google that. Answered in 2 seconds.
And again, I think there are some things, and I think this is where I don't like talking generational stereotypes, but as you look at the generations, there are things that you look at that have changed. And even to your point, even expectations, where maybe 10, 15 years ago, it would have been considered rude to be sitting on your phone. If somebody asked you a question, that would be perceived as rude. Now it's one of those like, oh, obviously you're just getting the information you need to help me. So I think there are some changes alongside that. And I think one of the things you hit on, I wrote something about this that I haven't posted about yet, but forcing compliance, in my opinion, is the lowest form of influence. Like it is the lowest form of influence when you're like, I need to get something done. What is the best way to get it done? Well, your last option should be, well, we're just going to make people do it, and then it's going to happen. Versus what you're talking about is embracing and saying, listen, they've already got these devices in their hands, all these things. Yes, let's recognize the risks associated with it, but let's mitigate those risks and treat them like adults instead of, well, I know what we're going to do. We're going to strip you of the things that we know you already have and make your life more inconvenient. And then hopefully you're going to deliver a superior customer experience, which, well, who wouldn't quit and things like that?
Yeah, I would even take it a step further. Like, I mentioned, I think in our preamble, we talked about a gentleman out of Stanford. His name is Tony Seba. He's a professor there on disruption. And he talks about the curve of disruption, and he likens it to, like the horse and buggy versus the EV, and focusing on the problem worth solving, right? And so he shows a picture of like Park Avenue in 1908, and it's a bunch of horse and buggies and one steam-powered car. And he says, if you went and did voice of the customer work with these people, and you said, what do you need? What would they say? And he hypothesized that they would say things like, I need cheaper hay, or a bigger, more comfortable buggy, or a faster, younger horse. Nobody said internal combustion engine, right? They wouldn't have come up with that. But Henry Ford developed the Model T in 1906. 1908, it was released. By 1913, it completely revitalized the manufacturing industry. And by 1920, if you weren't a cowboy, you didn't have a horse or a buggy. You drove a car, because the problems to solve were, how do I get somewhere further, faster, cheaper, right? And the problems we have to solve are empowering employees at their time of need with the information that is critical to solve their problems. And so, like, if I told you today that I was going to be an encyclopedia salesperson, and I was going to go door to door and sell these encyclopedias that have, quote unquote, all of the information on all of these topics that is immediately up to date, you tell me I was insane. Yet organizations continue to be binder-based, paper-based, clipboard-based, with information that is out of date, that isn't governed, and they're using it to capture like form-fill data that you can never leverage, because no one's going to take that time to grab all that paper-based form-filled data and digitize it. And all of that can be done digitally today. And it's just crazy to me that like B2C apps that I can buy as a consumer are ahead of where B2B companies are with their enterprise learning platforms.
I completely agree with that. So on that, as we come into the home stretch on this, one kind of question that I have for you, both as a senior leader and then also running this, is I think by and large, there are some folks I know out there who are really thinking about this the right way and are dealing with organizations who are highly distracted with the uncertainty around them and all that's going on. And sometimes the sound of making a big change like this, especially when you look at the statistics of how many digital transformations just pancake. So going to the board, going to the C-suite and saying, hey, I've got this great way that I think we can positively impact, can be very intimidating for some. Where do you recommend people get started with that? And what are some ways that they can make some key strides? Because I think sometimes going back to, and this happened before we went live, sometimes people are approaching this from, we got to boil the ocean or eat the whole elephant. And it's like, well, yeah, you're going to get torpedoed and burn up in the atmosphere. So where have you seen people have success where they prove this out? Because my experience in my career has been, once you start proving capability in this and show operational impact and financial impact. Nobody's asking like, should we make this investment, when you're showing that the investment you're making vastly is reducing cost. But where do you see people having success get started?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not sure we can cover that in 5 minutes here, but
give it your 5-minute best.
Yeah, I'll try. So at a point in time in my career, I reported through Steve McMillan, the CFO at Kroger, through other folk. And Steve broke down process improvement in 3 simple steps. He said everybody overcomplicates things. So first and foremost, I have to know that the results, the measurements that matter to me. And he said, never less than 3, never more than 6. Right? These are your KPIs for what you're trying to do. I have to know that those measurements are real. There's no noise or flaws in my data, right? So let's pretend something like employee turnover is 22%. Time to fill open positions is 17 days, and the cost to train an employee is 40 hours at $20, right? So those measurements are true. Then I come up with a set of standard operating procedures, and I measure performance over time, and it looks like a plateau. It's not a mountain range. It's not going up and down. I prove that if I execute consistently, my measurements plus or minus 5% are normal. Then and only then can I introduce disruption and measure a rate of change. And I think a lot of organizations start with disrupting, and they don't have 3 to 6 clearly defined metrics where they know, I'm a cyclist. If I want to be faster, I can have a higher FTP or I can weigh less. Those are the only 2 metrics that matter, right? Nothing else.
Yeah.
So if I don't get on the scale every day to know how much I weigh, I'm setting myself up for failure, right? So you have to start with those 3 things, right? Jumping off point, consistency over time, and then introduce disruption. And when you think about introducing disruption, you said boil the ocean. Like, stack rank your problems we're solving. What are the 6 or 8 things that are detrimentally impacting our organization? Do like an intensity, frequency, and density evaluation of that. Meaning, is it a shark bite or mosquito bite? Does it happen once a year or 17 times a day? Does it happen at 2 of our locations or every location? And that will get you to value. And when you get to value, like I used to use this, I think it's some organizations call it an Eisenhower matrix. I would call it an assumption burn down. My number 1 problem we're solving is the only one I should focus on. Everything else is noise. And then what experiment that can I run to test if I can change that? And I don't have to, if I want to test a new onboarding program, I don't have to test it across 1,000 locations. I can pick 5 or 6 or 10 locations, run a test pilot program, measure a rate of change. And then for every experiment I run, at the end of the experiment, I pursue, pivot, or kill. What was my hypothesis? What expected improvement did I think I would see? And was it greater than or less than my expectations? And if it's less than, what am I going to do about it? Could I try something different? Or am I just going to kill that program?
So fantastic. Look at that. You did it. And again, we probably could have spent the entire conversation just on that part. But I think there are some major takeaways that people can think about on this. And I will be the first to say this is not always an easy conversation to have, because there is often you're battling the pressure of getting something done is better than getting nothing done. And you actually have to fight back that point. Because I agree with you on the transformation piece. Over the years, the number of times I've seen people go into, we need to transform this. And it's like, do you know what it is you're looking to transform first to even be able to do that? And I think that's one of my biggest concerns as AI continues to roll on. You start throwing AI on this stuff and it's like, you're just going to accelerate chaos faster than it was already in place. And I think doing that, and then again, fantastic summary of where I think people can start with that. So Mike, this has been an absolutely fantastic discussion. I really appreciate it. Continue to be impressed with what Inkling's doing and where it's at. So thank you so much for making the time and joining me today.
Oh, stop it. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. And hopefully we can do it again sometime.
All right. Sounds like a plan. Thanks, everybody. And we will see you next week.